Thank you. About 15 years ago now, the late Peter Workman approached me about this book. Workman had published quite successfully a book called 1,000 Places to See Before You Die, which some of you may know, and that was very successful. And one evening, as I recall, we were having cocktails at the Workman's home in Connecticut. Carol Ann, the owner of Workman Publishing, is here with us tonight. And Peter said, you know, I think we should do one of those books about 1,000 Things books about books. Would you like to write it? And I, without hesitation, said yes. And then I hesitated for 14 years to deliver the manuscript. So in addition to being visionary, Workman has been extraordinarily patient.
Peter used to take me out for lunch. He was at least every year, if not twice a year, and he would always talk about you and always talk about the books. So
Yes,
I think he died 5 years ago, so part of me, I know he was so fond of you, so part of me thinks that he must be very proud of this moment that we're all together.
I hope that's the case. I'm pretty sure it is. I think he'd be very pleased to see all these people here and to know that so many people are talking about the book and to see such a beautiful execution of the book by the whole Workman team. I mean, this was really an extraordinary effort in terms of the design, led by Janet Vicario, who's sitting right there. An extraordinary job of design. It was almost exactly a year ago today that I sent in the last bit of manuscript for this book. And the book, if you've seen it, it's 1,000 pages long. It's profusely illustrated. It's beautifully designed. And it went off to the printer, I think, in March. So between November and March, there was a lot of work done, and the production and everything is just gorgeous. I think Peter would be delighted.
Did you read all 1,000 of these books?
Yeah, well, I've read the vast majority of them. But as you know, when you've been a bookseller long enough, there are some books that you've talked about so often that you're become convinced you've read them. So I'm sure there's a couple of dozen like that in here, but I've become familiar enough with them to write about them.
Because you have the Quran and the Bible in there and things like that, the 9/11 report.
Yep. Yeah, it's pretty broad range of titles, but those, in fact, I did read. Yes. 14 years is a long time.
Can you describe your process in eliminating all the 130 million books that are in print to whittle it down to 1,000 books?
Well, I think process is dignifying the whole thing with a little more rigor than it had. But what I did at the start was make an enormous list of books, which was several thousand. And this was books that I had loved myself, or books that I had loved selling and grown to love through the advocacy of other readers. You mentioned the catalog that I ran for 20 years called The Common Reader, and that was a wonderful community. It was you could call it a book blog with a social community of readers, except Al Gore had yet to invent the internet. So we just printed these newsprint catalogs and we mailed them out. We had hundreds of thousands of customers around the country, and they would often write in after they purchased books to say that they were delighted to discover a certain book, but also to recommend other books that they thought belonged with the collections that we were making. And my wife, Margot, who's here, and I, as she knows, we still have 8 filing cabinets in our basement filled with these letters that people would send us, just prompting us to discover new books, to put them in the catalog, and even bring some of them back into print. Abetted by publishing people like Herman Graff, who's sitting there in the audience, in many books, we got a recommendation, like The Worst Journey in the World was one by Apsley Cherry Gerard. They said, Herman, do you know this book? He said, no. And so we got together and he did a paperback edition and we sold it in the catalog. So that kind of reader enthusiasm for books was the criterion. That it wanted to be a book that either I wanted to give to someone and say, you have to read this, or someone had given to me with the same passion. It was still many more books than could be included. So what I finally decided to do as a framework was to, I was reading a book by Edmund Wilson, the great literary critic. And at one point, he has a passage about the miscellaneous learning of the bookstore unorganized by any larger principle, which seemed to me a perfect rubric for this project. So I said to myself, what if I only had 1,000 books? I had a bookstore. I could only have 1,000 books. And I wanted to have something for anyone who might come in looking for a book. And so that helped me to narrow it down and to get the right kind of ranginess that I wanted, because I wanted the book to be fun for people to explore when they opened it, not just a kind of static reference work.
And you can open up a bookstore like this. You can have a chain of 1,000 books.
Well, we could talk about that. Maybe we could go into partnership.
Yeah. But I think you went beyond this too. I know you said 1,000 books, but then I look, at the end of the book description, you have try this, and then you have the audio books, and then you have other books written by that author too. So you kept going on and on and on.
Yes, every book of the 1,000 has a short essay that I wrote about it to give context and to be a kind of invitation to the book. And then at the end of each of those essays, there are endnotes, which has bibliographic information, when the book was first published, what the best translation may be if it's a translated work, but also recommendations for further reading, either other books by the same author or further reading on the subject, if it's a book about the Civil War or World War II or football. And then also other books to try if you like that one. So all told, there's about 5,500 books referenced in this book, and all indexed in the back. And also, I should add, because I always forget to say this, we've built a website, 1000bookstoread.com, which is 1000bookstoread.com, which has one question at the top of it. What book should everybody read before they die? It has my list. It has 3 buttons next to the books I've chosen. And there's a little snippet from the book itself. But the buttons are agree. The second button is life's too short. And then the third button added to a to be read pile. And readers, all of you can go on to that site and add your own books as answers to that question, beyond the 1,000 that I've chosen for this book. And there's no sales on the site. It's designed as a tool for stores and for libraries. People can come in on their phones and sort the list by genre or by subject and find interesting things to read.
So if you were writing a book, the one book you had to read before you die.
Well, now that I've finished it, it would be this one.
Right, okay, got it.
For a long time, I wasn't sure I was going to get there.
I want to say I love your subheaders, and you, like on Shelby Foote's The Civil War, you described it as the American Iliad. And then I love the 84 Charing Cross Road, you said, single white bibliophile seeks out-of-print companions. So you must have had a lot of fun imagining all these, how to summarize a book in a witty manner.
Yeah, and those were, sometimes they came easily, and sometimes they took longer to come up with than actually writing the essay, because it's hard to write short. As Mark Twain once said in a letter to somebody, I'm writing you this very long letter because I didn't have enough time to write you a short one.
Did you, I know going back to the choice of which books, did you get pressure from your daughters, from your wife, from Workman Publishing to include books in, because everybody has their opinion, and did you feel that?
Well, it's, I write in the introduction to the book that once people know you're writing a book called 1,000 Books to Read Before You Die, you can never enjoy a dinner party in quite the same way again. Because everyone has their own oar to put in. But I didn't feel too much pressure. It was more the enthusiasm of everybody for books that they really loved. And so that was part of the fun of the process. And for me, really part of the fun of the whole project is to promote those discussions among readers and among booksellers and librarians. We're just traveling around various stores and libraries across the country promoting the book, and that was a lot of fun to talk with audiences like this. And bookstores would often have displays of the book with books from within the book in it. And I would always say to the bookseller, you should also have a table with books that you think should be in it that I left out, because that's part of the fun.
Mm-hmm. I know you went down to we have the Strand 90 table, and
Right.
you were checking out what our choices were. I think you had everything in the book.
It was pretty good crossover, yeah.
Those are our favorite. Was it hard to sometimes not give the ending of the books in a synopsis of it? Like I know in the end of The Affair, you did not, so thank you. And Rebecca, you did not tell us what was going to happen.
Yes, I was very conscious of not providing any spoilers to the books, because I think that would, particularly for certain kinds of books, you wouldn't want to give it away. So I had to rein myself in sometimes. And it's hard to figure out, like, what part of the research was knowing enough to know what not to say for that reason in particular.
And you went really across all genres. Like you have children's books in here. You have a lot of travel logs.
Yes.
You have Freud's interpretation of dreams. So you really were, I think, so expansive.
Well, I wanted to have, I believe that people read the way they eat. So they might want a hot dog for lunch one day, and the next day they'll go out for a fancy French meal with wine and the whole 9 yards. And I think that's really important to our reading lives. And I wanted the book to represent that, to be more of a menu that people would find inviting, rather than a prescription, that was homework or physical therapy. And so I wanted to have something for every type of reading appetite. So you can start this book as a reader, if you have willing parents, with Goodnight Moon and Where the Wild Things Are, and go all the way through to Simone de Beauvoir's The Coming of Age, and C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed. So it's cradle-to-grave reading, I think you could call it.
Do you want to read your passage, and we'll open
Sure,
up
I'm going to read just a little bit from the introduction, and then we'll open it up for some questions. All right, I'll start with a line I already used, but it leads into other things. Once people know you are writing a book called 1,000 Books to Read Before You Die, you can never enjoy a dinner party in quite the way you did before. No matter how many books you've managed to consider, and no matter how many pages you've written, every conversation with a fellow reader is almost sure to provide new titles to seek out, or, more worryingly, to expose an egregious omission or a gap in your knowledge, to say nothing of revealing the privileges and prejudices, however unwitting, underlying your points of reference. For years, 1,000 books felt like far too many to get my head around, but now it seems too few by several multiples. So let me say what already should be obvious. This book is neither comprehensive nor authoritative, even if a good number of the titles assembled here would be on most lists of essential reading. It is meant to be an invitation to a conversation, even a merry argument, about the books and authors that are missing, as well as the books and authors included. Because the question of what to read next is the best prelude to even more important ones, like who to be and how to live. Such faith in reading's power and the learning and imagination it nourishes is something I've been lucky enough to take for granted as both fact and freedom. It's something I fear may be forgotten in the great amnesia of our in-the-moment news feeds and algorithmically defined identities which hide from our view the complexity of feelings and ideas that books demand we quietly and determinedly engage. To get lost in a story or even a study is inherently to acknowledge the voice of another, to broaden one's perspective beyond the confines of one's own understanding. A good book is the opposite of a selfie. The right book at the right time can expand our lives in the way love does, making us more thoughtful, more generous, more brave, more alert to the world's wonders, and more pained by its inequities, more wise, more kind. Thank you.
So who'd like to ask a question? We ask that you stand up and not be so timid.
Just go ahead and raise your hand and I can bring you a microphone so you'll be heard.
I'll ask a question to them. Tell me the value of any prizes, Pulitzer Prize, Nobel Prizes, National Book Awards in...
They weren't weighted, but they did help. I reviewed all the list of prize winners, to kind of make sure I wasn't overlooking something. But the award itself, except by giving the book and easy access to the book in the list of prizes, didn't mean all that much.
Hi, Jim.
Hi, Marcia.
Hi. I would like to ask you, what are you reading now, except that you're probably not reading now. But if that's not if you aren't reading now because you're so busy, what's the last book you read?
Well, I'll have a two-part answer. The last book that I've read that I want to recommend to everyone is a book called These Truths by Jill Lepore, which is a history of the United States from the discovery of the North American continent up until 2 years ago. That is remarkable in being 800 pages long, but still very readable. But it reveals themes that we are grappling with as a country now that have been present from 1776 and before. And so it's kind of instructive. So I recommend that to everyone. The book I'm reading now, actually, is by an author who is appearing at another Strand event tonight at the China Institute called The Three-Body Problem. And I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name.
Cixin Liu.
Cixin Wu. It's a marvelous book, science fiction book, recommended to me quite passionately by a reader whose taste I trust. So I'm in the middle of that.
We'll probably have signed copies left over, too.
Oh, good.
Jim, could you speak a little bit about the challenges and the interesting aspects of reading something that's in translation?
Yes, that's a great question. I tried to be as international as possible, given the fact that I was writing for an American market, and so predominantly works in English. But there's more than 200 works in translation. I think we're having a fire drill. Okay. And so with translation, there's a couple of issues. One is for the older works, because if you're talking about Homer or the Greek tragedies or any of Latin literature, there are many, many translations. So how do you pick the best ones? Which I was careful to try to do, to recommend to people, because there's nothing worse than someone picking up a great book like the Odyssey and having a translation that is dated or stilted or doesn't really speak to a modern reader. So for those books, I was pretty familiar with and recommended translations. For classic works, it's the same thing. Every great book for each new generation has a new translation, in part because the language changes, and in part because publishers want to keep it under copyright. But that means there's lots of choices to make. So I was careful there too. What is particularly difficult in terms of works in translation is that any works that we get of contemporary literature that are translated from another culture are already filtered by an editor or a publisher who is deciding that this book would appeal to an American or a British market. That's why it's translated. So you'd never really know if you're actually getting a deep picture of what the literature is of another culture. So it's problematic, but it's fun too.
Hey, Jim. So I really love your description of cradle-to-grave reading. I think one of the interesting follow-on questions to that is books change when you read them and what you've read before.
Yes.
So how did you think about your process for when a person might be reading a given book? And so I'm sure your perspective on a children's book differs from when you were a child versus when you were reading it to your daughters. Talk to us about that.
That's a great question. And I tried to be conscious of the fact that I wanted this book to appeal to somebody who was 17 as well as 37 and not just at my age. So when you read a book when you're younger, it has a certain meaning to you, and some books get richer if you reread them when you're older. I think particularly of Middlemarch by George Eliot, which is my own favorite novel, which I read when I was 19, and I thought was the wisest book I had ever read then. So much so that I read it every decade since then, and it just seems to have gotten so much wiser. And it was all in there at the beginning, but you notice different things. And then there are other books that you read that were really important to you. In my case, a book like On the Road by Jack Kerouac, which was a marvelous book to read when you were young. And it's important that those books be represented here as well. It's still a marvelous book, but not quite as overwhelming as it is when you read it when you're 20 years old. And then there are books that are totally different. I'll tell a little story. I was fortunate enough to meet the author Joseph Heller once at a cocktail party. And at the time I met him, his book Catch-22 had been listed on a list that the Modern Library had put out of the 100 best novels of the 20th century, and it was number 6. So I went up to him at this party because he lived down the road from my wife's parents, and I said, "Congratulations on, the book being so high on the Modern Library list." He said, "Thank you very much." And I said, "But I think they picked the wrong book." And he glared at me. He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, I always thought that your second book, Something Happened, was a much better book." And he just glowed. He said, "So did I." And so I told him about my experience with that book. I'd read it when it came out in the 1970s. I was probably in college. And I thought this was the funniest book I had ever read. I memorized whole pages of his description of office life because I found them so amusing. And he said to me, he goes, and I told him that, and he said, it's really a middle-aged person's book. I said, "Yeah, I know, because I reread it last year, and I found it completely horrifying." I said, all the things that I had found very amusing when I was a callow 20-year-old, as a middle-aged person, I was just saying, "Oh, there but for the grace of God go I." So the books change, and they speak to you in different ways at different times.
I was just reading Patti Smith's Just Kids, and it was published in 2010. And I first picked it up, and it was she was stealing books from Britannos and Scribners, and I cannot read this book. She steals from booksellers. And then I just picked it up recently, and it's so poetic and so brilliant, but I needed that time to absorb this.
Yeah,
Yes, and
I just wanted to know, did you include any books you disliked but felt for some reason they were important or to be read, whether they made you angry, but deserved to be there as a warning or whatever.
Yes, Atlas Shrugged. It is a book that has assumed such prominence in our culture because it's beloved by many readers, which is fine, but the philosophy that, such as it is, that it espouses, wasn't enough to make up for the wooden characters and all of that. But it has been a book of enormous influence, and I think it's important that I wanted to read it and have something to say about it. But it's kind of like that book is, I don't know if you've read it, and maybe you love it, but it's kind of like watching your football team win a game 103-7 because it's so stilted in one direction. I presented it in context of the thinking and of its importance, and then I used some version of that line about the football game because that's the way I found it.
Jim, I have a literary question and a technical question.
Okay.
Literary question is, there are two books you've listed in here that I think are my candidates for the great American novel. So that is a concept. For 100 years, the concept of the great American novel. What do you think is the great American novel? Did you read it? And the tactical question is screens versus books. Did you read any of these books on screens or Kindles, or did you read everything in paper, and is there a difference?
I was the vice president of digital product for Barnes & Noble, so I read them on Nooks. But I did read some of these books on screens. I am promiscuous when it comes to reading. I would read on screens, or as Susan Sontag once said, I'd read on milk cartons if it was there in front of me. I think e-reading is convenient. If you're traveling or commuting, you could take several books at once. It's great for people who have want to make type bigger and smaller and all that stuff. So I don't have any qualms about that, except I don't know if any of you read ebooks, but this is a digression. But I found this interesting. When I started reading ebooks, and still to this day, if I'm in the middle of a novel and a character appears who appeared earlier and I can't quite remember who it is, my hand will start to flip back. And because in a physical book, you have this kind of sense that it was like 3 flips back and it was on the left-hand side. But in an ebook, you're in the middle of the ocean. You have no idea where you are or how to get back. And the other question of the great American novel, what are your two?
Sister Carrie and American Pastoral.
Well, they're both in here, and I love both those books. And American Pastoral, particularly because of the scenes in which Roth depicts the vibrant life of Newark and then its rapid decline. Because those of us who are, I'm from the Bronx originally, and I know when I was small what a vibrant city it was, as was Brooklyn, before Brooklyn was, recast as a sitcom recently. But that whole kind of urban decline had never been, in my reading, so vividly captured. But if I had to pick one, it would probably be Moby Dick, because it embodies the kind of combination of work ethic and craft and labor and craziness, on the other hand, and sense of manifest destiny that is all part of the American psyche, both of those things. So,
hey, Jim. Very, very exciting to be here. Thank you so much. That was a perfect segue, Moby Dick, for what I'm about to ask you. So there's a lot of people here that know you personally for a long time and are very grateful to you for your inspiration, both as someone who has always shown us the beauty of books and what it can do in our lives, but also just as a dear friend. So if I could get just personal for a minute, I think we've talked a lot about books, we haven't talked about you. And I think two things. One, a common reader was an incredible accomplishment. This is an incredible accomplishment. You can have passion for books, you can love the arts, you can do all that, but you made both those things happen, both when probably you and I both thought you were nuts. Can you talk a little bit about, and I think you used some of the words in talking about Moby Dick and what you admired, that both influenced you, inspired you, and helped you through both those processes?
Well, thank you. Be an envelope for you later. I part of me wants to say, and I think this is in large part true, that I fell in love with books and the written word very early. I never wanted to do anything else. I tried to find ways that would keep those things primary to what I had to do every day for my job. And I was either determined or unimaginative enough to just keep doing the same thing and finding another way to do it. So when one operation like A Common Reader closed to find some other way to do it, this book came along about that time, and some other projects at Barnes & Noble. And I didn't really want to do anything else, and I wanted to find a way to keep being near the stuff that I loved and that gave me energy. So more than anything else, it was the sense that I loved doing this, I was good at it, and I liked nothing better than to be able to express in some way succinctly what a book was about or what it said to me. And as long as I could have that opportunity to write about books in that way and to share that with others, that was what I was going to do. It's also, there's a lot of improvisation. So A Common Reader came about because I was working in a bookstore, and I said to myself, well, how can I do this and, not sell books I don't like and not have to be here on Saturday? So I came up with the catalog.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks so much for sharing tonight.
Sure.
So my question is whether any particular attention was paid to the races, genders, and nationalities of the authors represented in your book, or if the focus really was on just the literary merit of the substance, or if those things can be divorced at all. But
I don't think they can be divorced as easily as we'd like to divorce them. And so I was looking for books of quality that spoke to readers, whatever their provenance was. I was conscious of the fact that women certainly throughout history have been underrepresented. If you start a book with Homer and go all the way up, it's not until the late 19th century and even the middle 20th century where the outputs become somewhat equal. So you're going to have an imbalance there. In terms of ethnicity and race and language, it was the same thing. I was conscious of not following any other dictates of what a canon would be other than that it was good reading. So there is, I think, a fair representation of those different categories, although not as rich as I would like it to be for reasons having to do with my own limited reading, but also having to do with the nature of literary history.
So, given that a 1,000-book list is probably a moving target, can you tell us about the 1,000th book that made it onto the list and the 1,001st book that didn't?
The last book that I wrote about was a book called, was also the most recent book in the book, which is Life in Code, A Personal History of Technology by Ellen Ullman, which was published last year. And that's a marvelous book. Ellen Ullman is a very interesting writer. She began her career as a software developer in Silicon Valley, in the very early days of Silicon Valley, and she was one of the few women developers at that time. And about 20 years ago, she wrote a book that's become something of a cult classic among coders called Close to the Machine, which was really about how coders think and so on. And then she went on to write 2 novels, one called By Blood and the other called The Bug. And then last year she published this book called Life in Code, which is a series of essays that it's about technology, but it's more about the world that technology has made for us and how we live in it today. And it's a marvelous book. You learn a lot about technology and coding, but you learn even more about life. She's just a marvelous writer. That's probably the book that I've given to the most people myself because I wanted them to read it in the past year. And the one that didn't make it, was the last one that was there, is a book, children's book, picture book, called Burnt Toast on Davenport Street by a man named Tim Egan. And it is a marvelously funny, delightful, warm book about a family of animals. And it's a great picture book to read to a toddler. But it's important to me, and because I discovered this book one day in children's bookstore in Manhattan, where I was with my daughter. My younger daughter, Iris, was about 3 years old. And she was wandering around while Margot and I and her Iris's elder sister were looking. And she saw this book that was at her eye level. She marched over. She took it off the shelf. She brought it over to me and said, "I want this one." And I brought it home and read it to her. And that was the first of probably 792 readings of that book. And it was a great book. So I was so delighted that she had somehow, through osmosis, gotten the book-selling gene. She knew immediately that this was a great book. So that is a great personal attachment to me. So
Putting your
that
whole
didn't
family,
make the cut.
You're putting your whole family to work on it.
Exactly. Yes.
We have time for one final question. All right.
My question, Jim, would be, are there any authors you felt you might have shortchanged that you wanted to have multiple entries because you like that author so much, but you had to put in an author who had just one great book, but maybe not as good as the second or third book of Faulkner, Dickens, pick a name?
Well, the whole project has been plagued with that kind of issue, whether the person was in the book at all, whether you could put more books in it. There's about 36 authors who have more than one book. And even some of those, now looking back, I'm not sure I got right. So Virginia Woolf has 4 books because she's a marvelous writer. And the more I read at this point in my life, the more astonished I was. But when I finished the book, I went back and reread a novel of hers called The Waves, which I believe is better than any of the books I wrote about in it. So it's always changing and it's always new, you know. And there's so many books that could be in here. The book is alphabetical by author, so in the A's alone, you know, Aesop's Fables, Letters of Peter Abelard, the poetry of W.H. Auden, poetry of Anna Akhmatova, the novels of Kate Atkinson, the military histories of Rick Atkinson. I could go on with the stuff I've left out. So there's a part of me that every day since I finished this book feels like a slacker.
Thank you so much, James.
You're welcome.
It was a
Thank
great
you all for coming.
audience. Thank
Nice
you,
to see you
Workman.
all.
Thank you, C-SPAN.